Well, we can give a specific mitochondrial toxin called kainic acid. And if you have access to food or non-access to food, this is what happens over a period of time, 2, 4, 8 weeks. When you restrict food and yet both groups of animals get the same toxin, look at the amount of preservation of undamaged neurons in the group that has food restriction. This is restricted calories, same insult, same toxic insult, but look how well preserved those neurons are in the hippocampus compared to those who had unrestricted access, like our children do, to calories. And again, look at the hippocampus. Look at the restricted on the bottom here. This is the cell density in those animals when you restrict the caloric intake versus those animals that have unrestricted access to calories. Our society has unrestricted access to calories. We have no shortage of calories. Anyone who wants as much as you can stand can go to the back of the room right now. I mean, that's the way it is. We live in a time of plenty, and we're paying the price for it. Activity, function, behavior. Those animals that had restricted, after they got the kainate, restricted caloric, they had pretty preserved activity or preserved visuospatial memory, how soon they could visit a certain target in the maze. But those who had unrestricted access to food couldn't perform in the maze, these rats, after they got challenged by that kainic acid. So they become fat and dumb. 3-NP is a mitochondrial toxin given to the rats. If you restrict their calories ahead of time, they preserve their hippocampal neurons as opposed to this huge amount of neuronal dropout in those animals exposed to the mitochondrial toxin. So what is the play out of that? That caloric restriction reduces oxidative stress. How does it do that? It does that by preserving the function of mitochondria. It's nothing I don't think you can sell in a pharmacy. It's advice. It's advice that people need to cut back on their caloric intake. Is there a human payout here? You're darn right there is. Lower caloric intake, especially fat calories, reduces Alzheimer's and Parkinson's incidence. It provides protection by increasing the resistance to excitotoxic and metabolic insults, just like the rat study. The people of the lowest quartile of fat calories was 50% lower in terms of Alzheimer's. I didn't know how much time I have. I do have a few minutes. I'm going to talk about chelation in the brain because I think this is something that is important. And it was mentioned earlier this morning before I came up about topical DMSA, I think it was, for the treatment of autism. And, you know, any way that we can chelate out heavy metals in children and adults is a good thing, in my opinion. It's ubiquitous. I mean, we check red blood cell levels of is that thing getting annoying? Because it's bothering me. We look at erythrocyte levels of lead, cadmium, mercury, aluminum, and arsenic in almost every patient we see. And beyond that, we do chelation-challenged 24-hour urine collections using DMPS and to see where people are. And it's very surprising. I mean, we see people with levels of mercury 5 times the high cutoff, and lead every single day. And you do need to treat these people with chelation. Chelation has got such a stigma about that name. I mean, you know, people say, oh, he does chelation. It's sort of like, you know, it's almost very derogatory, at least in my very conservative community. But is there any data to support the fact that we should be looking at chelation in terms of a treatment for brain disorders? Well, only from some very marginal journals, like the most well-respected journals available to doctors these days. Here's the rationale. We talked about beta amyloid, and we talked about what a fundamental role beta amyloid plays in Alzheimer's disease because it enhances reactive oxygen species activity. It plays a role in hydrogen peroxide production, superoxide production. But it's this interaction with copper and iron with beta amyloid that enhances this activity. And we would expect that because these things do tend to enhance oxidative activity. When hydrogen peroxide interacts with beta amyloid, it becomes insoluble, so it can't come out of the brain, which it normally does, and cross-linked, which means it essentially becomes much more three-dimensional, and it remains in the brain. Once we have beta amyloid activity, it turns on the microglial. This increases free radical production and leads ultimately to pre-programmed cell death. So this whole production of beta amyloid in the brain, which is enhanced by diabetes, for example, ultimately leads to neuronal death. Iron mediates the toxicity of beta amyloid. in neuroblastoma cells that have beta amyloid in them, when you look at them in the presence of an iron chelator, which in this case was desferoxamine, you look at the presence of what's called cytotoxicity, cell death, amyloid before and amyloid after desferoxamine. The amount of cells that died when you gave a metal chelator in the laboratory was dramatically diminished in the presence of beta amyloid. Well, this is in a petri dish or some other kind of dish. Their conclusion that the toxicity of beta amyloid is mediated in part by redox or free radical production in relationship with iron, and that precipitates this damage to the lipids that is characteristic of Alzheimer's. Again, at the end of the day, what damages the brain is the damage that takes place to the fat in the brain. The lipid peroxidation of the brain happens, and that's what ultimately is measurable, and that's what leads to the degeneration of function in the Alzheimer's patient. You can measure lipid peroxidation with a simple urine test called urine lipid peroxides. You can go online and get kits, ulptest.com. You can go to ulptest.com and get kits. The Great Smokies has left this morning, but they have a urine lipid peroxide test. I use it in many of my patients. I talk about it in my book. Why? Because this gives you a handle on how well your antioxidant program is working for that person to decrease this activity, lipid peroxidation, which is a cornerstone of Alzheimer's. Well, here's our lipid bilayer, and here's some iron. Here's some iron that I threw in. And here's what happens. That iron, in the presence of amyloid, the amyloid binds the iron, which then goes into the lipid bilayer and damages the lipids. So this is what is lipid peroxidation. It's amyloid bound to iron, damages the cell membrane. Well, here's the iron again, and here comes some desferoxamine, an iron chelator. Now, this is all kind of theoretical, but if the desferoxamine binds the iron, then amyloid is much less damaging to the lipid bilayer. So here's the theory behind it. Well, let's put it to the test. This study published in The Lancet, a 2-year single-blind study of Alzheimer's patients given injections 5 days a week of this chelating agent, desferoxamine. The non-treated group declined at twice the rate as the treated group. The poetic silence. It is. It's big time. This is important information. Well, what happens to that information? What happened to that data? Here's from The Lancet, July of 2004. A whole section was devoted to looking at the effects of heavy metals in the brain. And here's some of the relationships that are found. We talked about iron in Alzheimer's. We talked about iron in Parkinson's. We know it's a player in MS. We know it's a player in atherogenesis in the carotids and also in the heart. We know that copper and zinc, probably through superoxide dismutase changes, are important also in familial ALS, which is about 15%, and also even in things like cataract formation. Iron, copper, zinc play important roles in enhancing, or in the case of zinc, reducing free radical-mediated damage, in this case, modifications of glucose that damage the lens. So there's plenty of information out there that tells us that we should be looking at this. Dr. Czerny has looked at a different chelating agent called chlyoquinol, which is being studied extensively. They treated genetically modified mice with this chelating agent, and they found that they reduced the amount of brain amyloid by 49%. They removed brain amyloid. They reduced the amount of brain amyloid by 49% without toxicity. That was published in 2001.